The radio crackled with static at 3:47 hours, breaking the suffocating silence that had blanketed forward operating base Coast for 3 days. Major Cassandra Ghost Thorne sat in the operations center, her fingers drumming against the metal desk as she stared at the green glow of the communication console. The message came through fragmented, desperate voices cutting through electronic snow like knives through fabric. Bravo 6 to any station. We are 8 clicks north of grid. Heavy contact. Need immediate extraction. The transmission dissolved into white noise, leaving only the hum of generators and the distant thump of rotor blades somewhere in the Afghan darkness. Ghost leaned forward, her steel-gray eyes reflecting the amber lights of the radio equipment. She had been monitoring emergency frequencies for 72 hours straight, subsisting on black coffee and determination while her male colleagues took shifts. They called her obsessive. She called it thorough. The difference had saved lives before. Bravo 6, this is Overwatch 7. Say again your position and nature of casualties. Her voice carried the calm authority of someone who had pulled miracles from impossible situations, though few in the command structure gave her credit for those miracles. Static answered her, then faintly like a ghost itself. Road, narrow mountain road, surrounded, can't hold much longer. The operations officer, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, emerged from his quarters wearing yesterday's uniform and 3 days of stubble. What's the situation, Major? His tone carried the familiar edge of skepticism that had followed Ghost throughout her military career. A female pilot asking for complex mission approval always seemed to require extra justification. We have a SEAL team requesting emergency extraction from an unknown location approximately 8 kilometers north of our position. They're under heavy fire and running out of time. Ghost's fingers moved across her tablet, pulling up satellite imagery of the region. The terrain was a nightmare of rocky outcroppings, narrow valleys, and roads that existed more in theory than in practice. Webb studied the screen, his jaw tightening. Negative. Weather's closing in, visibility near zero, and we don't have precise coordinates. No helicopter pilot would attempt that run in these conditions. We'll have to wait for daylight and better intel. Ghost felt something cold settle in her stomach. In daylight, there might not be anyone left to extract. She had heard that particular tone of desperation before, the sound men made when they knew they were about to die. The operations center fell into uncomfortable silence, broken only by the steady tick of a wall clock and the occasional burst of radio chatter from routine patrols. Webb returned to his quarters, leaving Ghost alone with her thoughts and the weight of 8 lives hanging in the balance somewhere in the Hindu Kush Mountains. She looked at the weather reports on her terminal. Visibility, less than 50 meters. Ceiling, indefinite. Wind gusts approaching 40 knots. By every regulation in the Air Force manual, Webb was right to ground all aircraft. By every instinct she had developed over 12 years of flying cargo planes into places where cargo planes had no business being, those SEALs were going to die unless someone did something impossible. Ghost stood slowly, her decision already made. She had spent her career being told what was impossible. Tonight, she was going to prove them wrong again. The hangar smelled of jet fuel and hydraulic fluid, familiar scents that had become more comforting to her than any perfume. Her C-17 Globemaster III sat in the center of the vast space like a sleeping giant, its gray bulk reflecting the harsh fluorescent lighting. The aircraft had been her partner for 4 years, carrying supplies and personnel across some of the most dangerous airspace in the world. Tonight, it would carry hope to 8 men who had given up expecting rescue. Chief Master Sergeant Diego Ramirez found her conducting her pre-flight inspection in the dim lighting beneath the aircraft's belly. "Major, you're not scheduled for any missions tonight." His weathered face showed concern rather than suspicion. Unlike many of her colleagues, Ramirez had learned to read the signs when Ghost was planning something that would either save lives or end careers. "Emergency extraction mission, Chief. I need you to prep the aircraft for immediate departure." She didn't look up from her checklist, knowing that meeting his eyes would invite questions she wasn't ready to answer. "Ma'am, with respect, I haven't seen any authorization for night operations. The weather. The weather is manageable for someone who knows how to handle this aircraft." Ghost finally looked at him, and Ramirez saw something in her expression that made him step back. It was the same look she had worn during the evacuation of Musakala, when she had landed her transport plane on a damaged runway while Taliban mortars fell around them like deadly rain. Ramirez nodded slowly. "I'll get her ready, Major, but if command asks, I'm going to tell them you ordered me to prepare for a routine supply run to Bagram." "I appreciate that, Chief." Ghost's voice softened slightly. Ramirez was one of the few people in the Air Force who had never questioned her competence based on her gender, never suggested that flying cargo planes was somehow less demanding than piloting fighters. He judged her by the same standard he applied to everyone: results. The pre-flight inspection revealed what she already knew: the C-17 was in perfect mechanical condition. This particular aircraft, tail number 44128, had been her assignment since her deployment began. She knew every rivet, every system, every quirk in its handling characteristics. More importantly, she knew its limits, and she knew how to push beyond those limits when circumstances demanded it. Ghost climbed into the cockpit and began the startup sequence. The familiar ritual of switches, gauges, and system checks grounded her in the present moment, pushing away the doubts that whispered in the back of her mind. Outside, the wind howled across the airfield, carrying the scent of approaching snow and the promise of even worse weather to come. The radio crackled to life as she contacted the control tower. "Tower, this is Cargo 7 requesting immediate departure clearance for emergency extraction mission." "Cargo 7, negative. All aircraft are grounded due to weather conditions. Return to parking." Ghost closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of 8 lives pressing down on her shoulders like a physical burden. She thought of her father, Colonel James Thorne, who had died in a helicopter crash in Iraq when she was 22 years old. He had been attempting a rescue mission that everyone had called impossible. The last thing he had told her was that sometimes the impossible was just something no one had been brave enough to attempt yet. Her hands moved across the controls with practiced precision, bringing the massive engines online. The C-17 shuddered to life around her, its 4 turbofan engines spooling up with a growing roar that drowned out the protests from the control tower. Through her headset, she could hear Webb's voice joining the chorus of objections, but his words seemed to come from very far away. Ghost released the brakes and began her taxi toward the active runway. The aircraft moved through the darkness like a ship navigating by dead reckoning, its landing lights cutting weak beams through the swirling snow. Behind her, the cargo compartment stood empty except for medical supplies and survival equipment, everything she would need if she managed to find the trapped SEALs alive. The tower continued its protests, but Ghost had switched to the emergency frequency, listening for any sign of the men she was risking everything to save. Static filled her headset, broken occasionally by fragments of desperate communication from somewhere in the mountains ahead. At the end of the runway, Ghost paused. Beyond the nose of her aircraft lay weather that had grounded every other pilot on base, terrain that had killed more experienced aviators than she cared to count, and a mission that violated every safety protocol in the Air Force handbook. Behind her lay the safety of the hangar, the comfort of following orders, and the certainty that no one would blame her for refusing to attempt the impossible. She pushed the throttles forward, and the C-17 began its roll into the storm. The takeoff was unlike anything Ghost had experienced in her 12 years of military aviation. The C-17 fought for every foot of altitude as crosswinds buffeted its massive frame, and the snow fell so heavily that her forward visibility dropped to mere yards beyond the cockpit windows. She flew by instruments alone, trusting in her training, and the aircraft's sophisticated navigation systems to keep her pointed in the right direction. At 5,000 feet, she broke through the worst of the weather and found herself flying through a world of ethereal beauty. Above, stars pierced the clear night sky with crystalline precision, while below, clouds stretched like a white ocean to every horizon. The mountains poked through the cloud layer like islands, their peaks painted silver by moonlight and shadow. Ghost activated her radio and transmitted on the emergency frequency. Bravo 6, this is Cargo 7. I'm airborne and heading to your location. Need you to maintain radio contact so I can find you. The response came immediately, filled with surprise and desperate hope. Cargo 7, this is Bravo 6 actual. We're taking heavy fire and running low on ammunition. Are you seriously flying in this weather? Bravo 6, I'm going to need you to activate any signaling devices you have and give me a terrain description of your position. How many personnel for extraction? 8 souls, all ambulatory but 3 with significant wounds. We're on a narrow mountain road with steep drops on both sides. Enemy positions are approximately 200 meters upslope from our location. Ghost studied her moving map display, correlating the SEAL team's description with satellite imagery of the area. She found 3 possible roads that matched their description, but only one that might, and she emphasized might, be wide enough and straight enough for a C-17 to attempt a landing. The thought of landing a 174-foot cargo plane on a mountain road in zero visibility conditions should have terrified her. Instead, Ghost felt the familiar calm that descended when she was faced with a problem that required every ounce of her skill and experience to solve. This was what she had trained for, even if no instructor had ever imagined this specific scenario. Bravo 6, I'm going to attempt to locate your position visually. When you hear my engines, pop smoke and activate strobes if you have them. Roger Cargo 7, and thank you, no one else would even consider flying tonight. Ghost decreased her altitude, descending back into the weather layer with the slow deliberation of someone walking into a minefield. At 2,000 feet above ground level, she was completely blind again, flying on instruments and intuition through mountain passes that left no room for error. 1 degree off course could send her into a rocky slope at 250 knots. Her radar painted a picture of the terrain ahead, jagged peaks and narrow valleys that seemed designed to trap aircraft. Ghost adjusted her heading based on the last known position of the SEAL team, using a combination of GPS coordinates and educated guesswork to navigate through the maze of stone and snow. The first sign that she was close came through her headset, the distant crackle of small arms fire. Ghost reduced her airspeed and began a slow, methodical search pattern, listening for any human sound that might guide her to the trapped men. The C-17's engines, normally designed for high-altitude efficiency, seemed impossibly loud in the mountain silence. Then she saw it, a brief flicker of red light against the white backdrop of falling snow. Smoke, barely visible but definitely artificial. Ghost banked toward the signal, her heart hammering against her ribs as she realized what she was about to attempt. The road appeared in her lights like a thin black ribbon stretched across the mountainside. It was narrower than she had hoped, bordered by rocky outcroppings that would shred her wings if she misjudged the approach by even a few feet. But it was straight, and it was long enough, barely, for a C-17 to land and stop. Ghost keyed her radio. Bravo 6, I have visual on your smoke. I'm going to make one pass to assess the landing zone, then commit to the approach. Be ready to move fast when I touch down. Cargo 7, that road is barely wide enough for a truck. Are you sure about this? Ghost looked at the narrow strip of asphalt appearing and disappearing in her landing lights, calculated wind speed and stopping distance, and thought about 8 men who would die if she turned back now. Bravo 6, I'm sure. Stand by for landing. The approach required every bit of skill Ghost had accumulated over thousands of flight hours. She brought the massive aircraft down at the steepest angle she dared, fighting crosswinds that wanted to push her into the mountainside while maintaining enough airspeed to prevent a stall. The road rushed toward her landing lights, looking impossibly narrow and uncertain. At the last moment, Ghost saw muzzle flashes from the slopes above the road. The enemy forces that had pinned down the SEAL team were now shooting at her aircraft. Tracer rounds streaked past her cockpit windows like angry fireflies, some impacting the C-17's armored belly with metallic pings that she felt more than heard. The main landing gear touched the rough asphalt with a jarring impact that sent vibrations through the entire airframe. Ghost immediately deployed the thrust reversers and engaged maximum braking, fighting to keep the aircraft centered on the narrow roadway as it decelerated from landing speed to taxi speed in less than 2,000 feet. She brought the C-17 to a stop with its nose pointing back down the mountain, engines still running and cargo ramp already beginning to lower. Through her windows, Ghost could see 8 figures emerging from rocky cover along the roadside, moving with the disciplined urgency of special operations troops under fire. Bravo 6, Cargo 7 is on deck. Load up and let's get out of here. The SEALs appeared at her cargo ramp within seconds, carrying their wounded and providing covering fire as enemy rounds continued to pepper the area around the aircraft. Ghost watched through her mirrors as the 8 men disappeared into her cargo compartment, their movements efficient despite the chaos surrounding them. Cargo 7, all personnel aboard. We are secure for takeoff. Ghost didn't wait for formal confirmation. She released the brakes and pushed the throttles to maximum power, beginning her takeoff roll down the same narrow strip where she had just landed. The difference was that now she was going uphill, into a headwind, with 8 additional passengers and enemy forces with a clear line of sight to her aircraft. The C-17 accelerated slowly, its engines screaming as they fought against gravity and aerodynamics. Ghost held the aircraft on the center line through pure force of will, making tiny corrections with the rudder pedals as crosswinds tried to push her into the rocky walls on either side of the road. At rotation speed, she pulled back on the stick and felt the main gear lift off the asphalt. The C-17 climbed away from the mountainside with precious little altitude to spare, its engine straining as Ghost banked sharply to avoid the peaks that surrounded their improvised landing zone. Behind her, she could hear one of the SEALs on the intercom. "Holy shit, that was the most incredible piece of flying I've ever seen." Ghost smiled for the first time in 3 days. It was a start. The flight back to forward operating base coast took 37 minutes, most of it spent climbing through the weather layer toward clear skies and safety. Ghost maintained radio silence, knowing that every transmission would be monitored by command staff who were probably preparing courts-martial paperwork with her name on it. In the cargo compartment, the SEALs worked on their wounded teammates with the calm efficiency of men who had performed battlefield medicine too many times to count. Ghost could hear their voices through the aircraft's internal communication system, status reports, requests for medical supplies, quiet words of encouragement to the injured. She thought about the moment when she had seen their smoke signal through the swirling snow, the split-second decision to commit to an approach that violated every safety protocol she had ever learned. There had been no time for doubt, no opportunity to second-guess her capabilities or consider the consequences of failure. There had been only the problem in front of her and the tools at her disposal to solve it. As they approached coast, Ghost could see the runway lights cutting through the darkness like a welcoming beacon. The familiar sight of home base should have filled her with relief, but instead she felt a growing weight of apprehension. Webb would be waiting for her with questions that had only one possible answer. She had disobeyed direct orders and risked a multi-million-dollar aircraft on a mission that no rational pilot would have attempted. The landing at coast was routine after the drama of the mountain road, a standard approach to a standard runway with standard weather conditions. Ghost taxied to the medical evacuation area where ambulances and medical personnel were already waiting, alerted by her radio call during the approach. As the SEALs disembarked with their wounded, Ghost remained in her seat, staring through the cockpit windows at the controlled chaos of the medical response. She had accomplished the impossible again, but the price was about to become clear. Lieutenant Colonel Webb appeared at the bottom of her crew ladder before the engines had finished spooling down. His expression was unreadable in the harsh ramp lighting, but Ghost could see the tension in his posture as he climbed toward her cockpit. "Major Thorne, you are relieved of duty pending a formal investigation into your unauthorized use of military aircraft." Webb's voice carried the cold formality of official displeasure. "You will report to my office at 800 hours tomorrow morning for debriefing." Ghost nodded, unsurprised by the response. She had known the cost when she made her decision, had weighed it against 8 lives and found the equation acceptable. "Yes, sir. The aircraft is Code 1, no mechanical issues to report." Webb's expression softened slightly, though his voice remained official. "The SEALs you extracted tonight, 3 of them wouldn't have survived until morning without immediate medical attention. Their team leader specifically requested that I pass along his gratitude for what you did." "I was just doing my job, sir." "No, Major. What you did tonight went far beyond any job description." Webb paused, seeming to struggle with something. "That doesn't change the fact that you violated direct orders and endangered military personnel and equipment. There will be consequences." Ghost understood. She had saved 8 lives, but she had also challenged the authority structure that kept military operations functioning. There would be a price to pay, and she would pay it without complaint. The men she had rescued were alive, and that was worth whatever came next. As she completed her post-flight checklist and prepared to shut down the aircraft, Ghost reflected on the narrow road that had served as her landing strip. By tomorrow, it would be covered with snow again, showing no sign that a C-17 had ever touched down there. But 8 families would receive phone calls instead of death notifications, and somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan, the impossible had become routine for 37 minutes. That night, as Ghost lay in her cramped quarters staring at the ceiling, she thought about her father and the helicopter crash that had claimed his life during another impossible rescue mission. She wondered if he had felt the same calm certainty in his final moments, the same conviction that some things were worth any risk. Through her small window, she could see her C-17 on the flight line, its bulk barely visible in the pre-dawn darkness. Tomorrow would bring questions, investigations, and probably the end of her military career. Tonight, 8 men were alive because she had refused to accept that impossible was the same thing as unthinkable. The radio in the operations center had been quiet since her return, but Ghost knew that somewhere in the Hindu Kush Mountains, other teams were moving through the darkness, carrying out missions that official channels couldn't support. When their voices crackled through the static asking for help that no one else could provide, there would be other pilots, other aircraft, other decisions to make about the difference between orders and duty. Ghost closed her eyes and tried to sleep, knowing that her dreams would be filled with narrow roads and falling snow, with the sound of turbofan engines straining against gravity, and the voices of desperate men calling through electromagnetic static for someone to do the impossible. In the morning, she would face the consequences of her actions. Tonight, she was content to know that impossible was just another word for something that hadn't been accomplished yet. The investigation began at 800 hours sharp in Webb's office, a sterile space decorated with military certificates, unit photographs, and the controlled disorder of a career officer managing too many responsibilities with insufficient resources. Ghost sat at attention in a metal chair across from Webb's desk, her dress uniform immaculate despite the fact that she had been awake for nearly 40 hours. Webb opened a thick folder and spread its contents across his desk: flight records, weather reports, photographs of her C-17 on the mountain road taken by the SEAL team's cameras, and testimony from the 8 men she had rescued. The evidence of her unauthorized mission filled the space between them like an accusation waiting for judgment. Major Thorne, before we begin the formal proceedings, I want to understand your thought process when you made the decision to launch your aircraft in violation of direct orders. Webb's tone was carefully neutral, but Ghost could hear the genuine curiosity beneath his official demeanor. Sir, I had 8 military personnel in contact with hostile forces, requesting immediate extraction from a position where they could not be reached by conventional means. I assessed the situation and determined that I had the capability to reach them safely. You assessed the situation. Webb picked up a weather report from his desk. Visibility near zero, ceiling indefinite, wind gusts up to 40 knots. Every pilot on this base had assessed the situation, Major. They reached a different conclusion than you did. Ghost met his gaze directly. With respect, sir, they weren't listening to the radio traffic from Bravo 6. I was. Those men were going to die if someone didn't reach them before daylight. That's not your decision to make, Major. You're a cargo pilot, not a rescue helicopter pilot. You don't have the authority to launch unauthorized missions based on your personal assessment of tactical situations. The words stung because they were true. Ghost was a cargo pilot, assigned to supply runs and personnel transport between established airfields with prepared runways and standard approach procedures. She had never been trained for combat search and rescue, never been authorized to make the kind of command decisions that her actions implied. But she had made those decisions anyway, and 8 men were alive because of them. Sir, I understand the nature of my assignment and the limits of my authority. I also understand that sometimes those limits are less important than the lives of the personnel we're supposed to support. Webb leaned back in his chair, studying her with an expression that seemed to combine frustration and admiration in equal measure. Major, in my 23 years of military service, I have never encountered a more blatant example of insubordination combined with more spectacular results. He pulled a photograph from the folder, Ghost's C-17 on the narrow mountain road, its massive frame somehow fitting into a space that seemed impossibly small. The image captured the incongruity of the moment. A strategic airlift aircraft designed for major airfields sitting on a ribbon of asphalt that barely qualified as a road. The SEAL team leader, Master Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, submitted a formal commendation request for your actions. He states, and I quote, Major Thorne displayed exceptional airmanship and complete disregard for her personal safety in order to save the lives of military personnel under hostile fire. Her actions represent the highest traditions of military service and deserve formal recognition. Ghost remained silent, unsure whether the commendation made her situation better or worse. Recognition for extraordinary actions often came with extraordinary consequences when those actions violated established protocols. Webb continued, however, Master Chief Rodriguez's opinion doesn't change the fact that you violated direct orders, endangered military equipment, and conducted an unauthorized mission without proper coordination with higher command. These are court-martial offenses, Major. The weight of potential consequences settled over Ghost like a physical burden. Court-martial meant the end of her military career, the loss of her pension and benefits, and possibly criminal charges that could result in prison time. She had known these risks when she made her decision, but the reality of facing them was more daunting than she had anticipated. Sir, I accept full responsibility for my actions and any consequences that result from them. I would make the same decision again under identical circumstances. Webb's eyebrows rose slightly, even knowing that it could end your career. Sir, I joined the Air Force to serve my country and protect military personnel. If doing that effectively ends my career, then I suppose I've accomplished my mission. For the first time during the interview, Webb smiled slightly. "Major, you sound exactly like your father." Ghost felt a shock of surprise. She had never mentioned her father to Webb, had never indicated that she was anything other than another cargo pilot trying to complete her deployment without incident. The reference to Colonel James Thorne suggested that Webb knew more about her background than she had realized. "You knew my father, sir." "I knew of him. His reputation preceded him, and apparently so does yours." Webb pulled another document from the folder, a message from higher command that Ghost couldn't see from her position. "I received a call this morning from General Morrison at Air Mobility Command. It seems that someone has been paying attention to your career, Major." Ghost remained silent, uncertain where the conversation was heading, but sensing that the investigation was taking an unexpected direction. Webb read from the document. "Major Cassandra Thorne has been selected for immediate reassignment to the 920th Rescue Wing, effective upon completion of current deployment. She will undergo specialized training in combat search and rescue operations and assume duties as aircraft commander for high-risk extraction missions." The words seemed to hang in the air between them, too significant to be absorbed immediately. Ghost had spent her career flying supply missions and routine personnel transport, always aware that more challenging assignments existed, but never expecting to be selected for them. Rescue wing assignments were typically reserved for pilots with specific qualifications and connections that she had never possessed. "Sir, I don't understand. How can I be receiving a specialized assignment when I'm under investigation for violating orders?" Webb's smile became more pronounced. "Major, sometimes violating orders is exactly the qualification that higher command is looking for. Your unauthorized mission last night demonstrated capabilities that can't be taught in flight school or measured by standardized evaluations." He closed the folder and leaned forward, his official demeanor shifting toward something more personal. "The investigation into your actions is closed, Major. Your mission has been retroactively authorized as an emergency combat search and rescue operation. Congratulations on a successful outcome." Ghost felt a wave of relief so intense that it was almost disorienting. She had prepared herself for courts-martial, had accepted the end of her military career as the price for saving 8 lives. Instead, she was being offered an opportunity that she had never dared to request. "Sir, I appreciate the confidence that higher command is showing in my abilities. I won't disappoint them." "I'm sure you won't, Major, but before you leave Coast, there's something else you should know." Webb pulled a final document from his desk drawer, a handwritten letter on personal stationery. "This arrived for you this morning, delivered by one of the SEALs you extracted." Ghost accepted the letter, recognizing the careful handwriting of someone accustomed to writing official reports. The return address showed Master Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, but the content was clearly personal rather than official. The letter was brief, but its words carried the weight of genuine gratitude. "Major Thorne, there are no words adequate to express what you did for my team last night. You risked everything to save 8 men you had never met, flying into conditions that would have grounded any rational pilot. My youngest team member is 19 years old, and he's going to see his 20th birthday because of your courage. I wanted you to know that we will never forget what you did, and neither will the families who still have their sons and husbands, because you refuse to accept that some things are impossible. Respectfully, Master Chief Rodriguez." Ghost read the letter twice, feeling something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized was constricted. Throughout her career, she had measured her success by mission completion rates and efficiency ratings, rarely receiving feedback about the human impact of her work. Rodriguez's words provided a perspective that no official evaluation could capture. "Major, your new assignment begins with 30 days of leave, during which you'll report to Moody Air Force Base for orientation and preliminary training." Webb stood, extending his hand in a gesture that seemed to formally conclude not just the investigation, but also her time at Forward Operating Base Coast. "I want you to know that it has been an honor serving with you, even when you were violating my direct orders." Ghost shook his hand, surprised by the firm sincerity of his grip. "Thank you, sir, for everything." As she left Webb's office, Ghost felt the weight of transition settling over her. Her career as a conventional cargo pilot was ending, but something new was beginning, something that would allow her to use her skills in ways that she had only dreamed about during long supply runs between routine destinations. She walked across the flight line toward her quarters, passing her C-17 in its parking spot. The aircraft showed no external signs of its adventure on the mountain road, its gray paint unmarked by the small arms fire that had peppered the area during her extraction of the SEAL team. But Ghost could see the subtle differences: minor scratches on the landing gear, slight scuffing on the belly where rocks had impacted during her unconventional landing. These were the marks of an aircraft that had been pushed beyond its normal operational envelope and had performed exactly as designed. Like its pilot, the C-17 had discovered capabilities that existed beyond the boundaries of standard procedures and official limitations. That evening, as Ghost packed her personal belongings for the journey to her new assignment, she found herself thinking about the narrow road in the Hindu Kush Mountains. By now, it was probably covered with snow again, showing no trace of the impossible landing that had taken place there. But somewhere, 8 families were having dinner together, making plans for the future living lives that would have ended if one pilot had not decided that impossible was just another challenge to overcome. Ghost folded Rodriguez's letter carefully and placed it in her personal files, next to a photograph of her father in his flight suit and citations from previous missions that had pushed the boundaries of standard operating procedures. The letter represented something more valuable than any official commendation: proof that her work had meaning beyond efficiency reports and mission completion statistics. As she prepared for sleep on her last night at Coast, Ghost looked through her window at the stars visible above the Afghan mountains. Somewhere among those peaks, other military personnel were conducting operations that might require extraction from impossible locations, facing challenges that would test the limits of human endurance and military capability. When those calls for help came through the radio static, there would be pilots ready to answer them. Pilots who understood that the most important missions were often the ones that couldn't be accomplished according to standard procedures. Ghost smiled, knowing that she would soon be among them, flying aircraft into places where aircraft had no business being, saving lives that couldn't be saved through conventional means. The impossible had become her specialty, and tomorrow she would begin learning how to make it routine. 3 weeks later, Ghost stood on the flight line at Moody Air Force Base in Georgia, looking up at the massive gray bulk of an AC-130U Spooky gunship. The aircraft was both familiar and alien, recognizable as a C-130 transport plane that had been extensively modified with sensors, communications equipment, and enough firepower to level a city block. This would be her new assignment: flying close air support missions for special operations forces in locations where conventional aircraft couldn't operate effectively. The transition from cargo pilot to special operations aviator required more than just learning new aircraft systems and procedures. It required a fundamental shift in thinking about the nature of military aviation and the acceptable level of risk in accomplishing the mission. Ghost had demonstrated her willingness to accept that risk during her unauthorized extraction mission in Afghanistan, but now she would be expected to manage it on a routine basis. Her training instructor, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen, was a 15-year veteran of special operations aviation with combat experience in Iraq, Afghanistan, and several classified locations that she referred to only as other places where the weather was bad and people were shooting at us. Chen had reviewed Ghost's personnel file and the circumstances of her reassignment, but her evaluation would be based entirely on performance during the intensive training program. Major Thorne, your reputation precedes you, but reputation doesn't mean much when you're flying nap of the earth at night through hostile territory with a full load of ammunition and 8 crew members depending on your decisions. Chen's voice carried the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had made those decisions too many times to romanticize them. Are you ready to find out if you can handle the transition from cargo hauling to combat operations? Ghost looked at the AC-130, its sensors and weapons pods giving it a predatory appearance that contrasted sharply with the utilitarian design of her familiar C-17. This aircraft was designed specifically for combat, optimized for the kind of high-risk missions that had previously existed at the margins of her experience. "Ma'am, I'm ready to learn whatever you're willing to teach me." Chen smiled, and Ghost caught a glimpse of the same expression she had seen on Webb's face. The recognition of someone who understood that the most important qualifications couldn't be measured by standardized tests or demonstrated in controlled training environments. "In that case, Major, let's go find out what you're really capable of." As they walked toward the aircraft, Ghost felt the same mixture of anticipation and uncertainty that had marked every significant transition in her military career. Behind her lay 12 years of routine supply missions and the single night that had changed everything. Ahead lay challenges that would test not just her flying skills, but her ability to make life-and-death decisions under conditions where the margin for error was measured in seconds rather than minutes. The AC-130's cargo ramp lowered with a hydraulic whine, revealing an interior that was crammed with electronics, ammunition storage, and crew stations that looked more like something from a science fiction movie than a traditional aircraft. Ghost took a deep breath, inhaling the familiar sense of jet fuel and electronics that marked her transition from one phase of her career to another. Somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan, a narrow road remained covered with snow, showing no sign that it had once served as a landing strip for a C-17 Globemaster III. But in the personnel files at Air Mobility Command, in the commendation letters from grateful special operations teams, and in the memories of 8 men who would grow old because one pilot had refused to accept the impossible, that road had become something more significant than its original purpose. It had become the place where Major Cassandra, Ghost, Thorne had discovered that her real mission was not flying cargo planes between established airfields, but flying hope into places where hope had no business existing. Now, standing at the threshold of an AC-130 gunship, Ghost prepared to make that mission official. The first thing Chen taught her was that everything she thought she knew about flying needed to be reconsidered. The AC-130 operated in a completely different realm from cargo aircraft, low altitude, high-threat environments where the difference between success and catastrophic failure was measured in split-second decisions and inches of clearance. Ghost spent her first week at Moody learning systems that had never existed on her C-17. Infrared targeting pods, defensive countermeasures, and communication equipment that could coordinate with ground forces while simultaneously tracking multiple threats. "Forget everything you learned about standard operating procedures," Chen told her during their third training flight. "In special operations, the standard procedure is that there is no standard procedure. Every mission is unique, every target is different, and every decision you make will be scrutinized afterward by people who weren't there and don't understand the situation you faced." Ghost found herself adapting to a new rhythm of military life. Her days began at 4:30 with physical training that was more demanding than anything she had experienced as a cargo pilot, followed by classroom instruction on topics that ranged from advanced navigation techniques to the psychological effects of prolonged combat exposure. The training was designed to prepare pilots not just for the technical challenges of special operations aviation, but for the mental and emotional demands of missions where failure meant that people died. The other pilots in her training class were a mixture of experienced aviators transitioning from other aircraft types and younger officers who had been selected for special operations directly from flight training. Ghost found herself in the unusual position of being both the oldest student and the one with the least relevant experience, a combination that required her to prove herself repeatedly in environments where her reputation from Afghanistan carried little weight. During her 4th week of training, Ghost participated in her first simulated combat mission, a night interdiction flight against mock targets in a training area that replicated the terrain and threat environment of current operational theaters. The scenario involved providing close air support for a ground team that had been ambushed while conducting a reconnaissance mission, requiring precision engagement of enemy positions while avoiding civilian casualties and friendly fire incidents. Ghost took the pilot's seat of the AC-130, with Chen acting as aircraft commander and instructor pilot. The mission briefing had lasted 3 hours, covering weather conditions, target descriptions, friendly force locations, and rules of engagement that seemed to change every few minutes as the simulated tactical situation evolved. By the time they reached the target area, Ghost felt saturated with information and uncertain about her ability to process it all while simultaneously flying the aircraft in a high-threat environment. Ghost, this is Groundhog 6. We're taking effective fire from a building complex approximately 2 clicks east of our position. Request immediate close air support. The voice on the radio belonged to one of the instructors, but the urgency was genuine enough to trigger an adrenaline response that Ghost had not experienced since her unauthorized mission in Afghanistan. Chen's voice came through the intercom with calm authority. "Major, take us to the target area. Remember your altitude restrictions and friendly force locations. The sensor operator will talk you through the engagement sequence." Ghost banked the AC-130 toward the target coordinates, descending to the altitude required for weapons employment while scanning her instruments for any sign of simulated threats. Through her night vision goggles, the training area looked exactly like the terrain she had flown over during her deployment: rocky hills, scattered buildings, and roads that seemed to lead nowhere in particular. The sensor operator, Technical Sergeant Williams, began feeding her information through the intercom. "Pilot, I have visual on the target building. Multiple heat signatures consistent with enemy personnel. Friendly forces are marked with infrared strobes approximately 300 meters to the west." Ghost could see the strobes through her goggles, tiny points of light that marked the difference between a successful mission and a friendly fire incident that would end her career. The margin for error was smaller than anything she had dealt with as a cargo pilot, where the consequences of mistakes were typically measured in delayed schedules rather than lost lives. "Groundhog 6, this is Spooky 7. I have visual on your position and the target building. Confirm you are clear of the engagement area." "Spooky 7, we are clear. You are cleared hot." Ghost felt her heart rate increase as she maneuvered the AC-130 into an attack orbit around the target. The aircraft's forebeam cannon was loaded with training rounds that would register hits on laser targets without causing actual destruction, but the procedures and decision-making process were identical to combat operations. One mistake in target identification or friendly force location could result in simulated casualties that would be treated as real failures in her training evaluation. "Pilot, you're in position for engagement. Sensor confirms target identification and clear engagement zone." Williams' voice carried the same professional calm that Ghost had heard from air traffic controllers during routine operations, but the stakes were entirely different. Ghost squeezed the trigger, sending a stream of simulated forebeam rounds toward the target building. Through her headset, she could hear the sensor operator confirming hits and the ground controller reporting the cessation of enemy fire. The entire engagement had lasted less than 30 seconds, but it represented a fundamental shift in her understanding of military aviation. After the mission, during the debrief, Chen reviewed Ghost's performance with the methodical thoroughness that characterized all special operations training. Every decision was analyzed, every procedure was evaluated, and every alternative course of action was discussed in detail. Ghost had performed adequately for a pilot in her 4th week of training, but adequately was not sufficient for the missions she would eventually be assigned. Major, you hesitated for approximately 3 seconds before engaging the target. In combat, that hesitation could allow enemy forces to reposition or engage friendly personnel. You need to develop the ability to process tactical information more rapidly and act on it without second-guessing your initial assessment. Chen's criticism was delivered without personal animosity, but Ghost understood that her training was being evaluated against standards that allowed no room for uncertainty or delay. That night, alone in her quarters, Ghost reflected on the differences between her previous career and the path she was now following. As a cargo pilot, her primary responsibility had been the safe transport of personnel and equipment between established locations. Success was measured by on-time performance and adherence to standard procedures. Her unauthorized mission in Afghanistan had been an exception to her normal duties, a single night when circumstances had required her to exceed the boundaries of her training and experience. As a special operations pilot, exceeding boundaries would become routine. Every mission would require decisions that pushed the limits of aircraft performance and crew capabilities. The unauthorized rescue mission that had changed her career would be considered a normal Tuesday night in her new assignment. Ghost opened her laptop and began reviewing the technical manuals for the AC-130's weapons systems. The 40mm cannon that she had fired during the training mission was only one of several weapons available to the aircraft, each with different capabilities, limitations, and employment procedures. Mastering these systems would require the same dedication to detail that had made her proficient with cargo aircraft, but the consequences of mistakes would be measured in lives rather than logistics delays. Outside her window, she could see other AC-130s on the flight line, their distinctive sensor pods and defensive countermeasures giving them an appearance that was both menacing and purposeful. These aircraft existed for a single reason: to provide close air support for military personnel operating in environments where conventional forces could not reach them. In 3 months, Ghost would be flying one of these aircraft into combat, carrying the responsibility for missions that could determine the success or failure of special operations around the world. The transition from cargo pilot to special operations aviator was more than just learning new aircraft systems and procedures. It was a fundamental change in her relationship with military aviation and her understanding of the acceptable level of risk in accomplishing the mission. Ghost had demonstrated her willingness to accept that risk during her night in Afghanistan, but now she would be expected to manage it on a routine basis, making life-and-death decisions while maintaining the calm professionalism that special operations demanded. As she studied the weapons employment procedures, Ghost thought about the SEAL team she had rescued and the narrow road that had served as her landing strip. That night had been about refusing to accept the impossible, about finding a way to reach people who needed help regardless of the obstacles and regulations that stood in the way. Her new career would be about making the impossible routine, about developing the skills and judgment necessary to succeed in situations where failure was not an acceptable option. The next morning brought advanced navigation training, learning to fly precisely planned routes at low altitude while avoiding both natural obstacles and enemy detection systems. Ghost spent hours in flight simulators, practicing approaches to landing zones that existed only as coordinates on maps, learning to use night vision systems and radar to identify targets that were invisible to conventional aircraft. The training was intensive and demanding, but it was also exactly what she had been looking for without realizing it: an opportunity to use her aviation skills in direct support of military personnel who depended on her competence for their survival. Chen continued to push her beyond the comfortable boundaries of her previous experience, introducing scenarios that required split-second decision-making under conditions where the consequences of mistakes were immediate and irreversible. During one particularly challenging training mission, Ghost was required to provide close air support for a hostage rescue operation, while avoiding civilian casualties and coordinating with multiple ground units that were operating in close proximity to the target. Major, the key to success in special operations is not just technical proficiency with aircraft systems, Chen explained during one of their post-mission debriefs. It's the ability to process complex tactical information while maintaining situational awareness and making decisions that balance mission requirements with acceptable levels of risk. You can't hesitate, you can't second-guess yourself, and you can't allow the complexity of the situation to overwhelm your decision-making process. Ghost absorbed the lesson, understanding that her training was preparing her not just to fly a different type of aircraft, but to think differently about the nature of military aviation and her role within the broader framework of special operations. The cargo missions that had defined her previous career had been important, but they had been essentially routine, moving people and equipment from point A to point B according to predetermined schedules and procedures. Special operations aviation was different. Every mission was unique, every tactical situation required creative solutions, and every decision carried consequences that extended far beyond the immediate success or failure of the flight. Ghost was learning to think like a tactical aviator rather than a transport pilot, to see her aircraft not just as a means of transportation, but as a weapons platform capable of influencing the outcome of ground operations through precise application of firepower and logistics support. The weeks of training blurred together in a routine of early mornings, intensive classroom instruction, demanding flight training, and detailed mission debriefs. Ghost found herself adapting to the rhythm of special operations, learning to function effectively on minimal sleep while maintaining the level of precision and judgment that the missions required. Her fellow students came and went as some washed out of the program while others advanced to more specialized training, but Ghost remained focused on the goal that had brought her to Moody Air Force Base, becoming the kind of pilot who could accomplish missions that others considered impossible. During her final training evaluation, Ghost flew a complex scenario that combined elements from all of her previous training missions: night infiltration of a special operations team, close air support during a simulated combat operation, and emergency extraction under hostile fire. The mission required her to coordinate with multiple ground units, employ various weapon systems, and adapt to changing tactical situations while maintaining precise control of the aircraft in challenging flight conditions. Chen observed from the co-pilot's seat, evaluating Ghost's performance against the standards that would determine her assignment to an operational special operations squadron. This was the culmination of months of intensive training, the final demonstration of whether Ghost possessed the skills and judgment necessary to succeed in the world's most demanding aviation environment. Spooky 7, this is Groundhog 6. We have completed our mission and are ready for extraction. Landing zone is hot. Repeat, landing zone is hot. Ghost processed the information while simultaneously monitoring her altitude, airspeed, and position relative to known threats. A hot landing zone meant that enemy forces were present and actively engaging the personnel she was supposed to extract, requiring her to provide suppressive fire while coordinating the pickup operation. Groundhog 6, this is Spooky 7. I copy hot LZ. Stand by for close air support. The engagement sequence that followed demonstrated everything Ghost had learned during her training at Moody. She maneuvered the AC-130 into an attack orbit, coordinated with the sensor operator to identify enemy positions, and employed the aircraft's weapons to suppress hostile fire while the ground team moved to the extraction point. The entire operation required continuous decision-making under simulated combat conditions, balancing the need to protect friendly forces with the requirement to avoid civilian casualties and collateral damage. When the simulated mission concluded, Chen's evaluation was succinct. Major Thorne, you have successfully completed Special Operations Aviation training. Your assignment to the 4th Special Operations Squadron is confirmed. Congratulations and welcome to the community. Ghost felt a surge of satisfaction that was different from anything she had experienced during her previous military career. This was not just completion of another training program or qualification for another aircraft type. It was admission to an elite community of aviators who specialized in missions that existed at the intersection of technical proficiency and moral courage. That evening, as Ghost packed her belongings for the move to her operational assignment, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from cargo pilot to special operations aviator. The unauthorized mission in Afghanistan had been the catalyst, but the real transformation had occurred during the months of intensive training that had taught her to think differently about aviation, risk, and the nature of military service. Tomorrow, she would report to her new squadron and begin the process of integrating into an operational unit, where the training scenarios would become real missions with real consequences. The narrow road in the Hindu Kush Mountains that had changed her life would soon be joined by other impossible places where aircraft had no business being, other desperate situations that required pilots willing to push beyond the boundaries of standard procedures and acceptable risk. Ghost smiled as she closed her suitcase, thinking about the 8 SEALs whose lives had been saved by one night of flying that violated every regulation in the Air Force handbook. Soon, she would have the opportunity to save other lives, to accomplish other impossible missions, to demonstrate that the line between possible and impossible was often just a matter of finding the right pilot willing to cross it. The AC-130 that would become her new aircraft waited on the flight line at her next base, its sensors and weapons systems ready to support special operations teams in the world's most challenging environments. Ghost had proven that she possessed the technical skills to operate the aircraft effectively, but more importantly, she had demonstrated the judgment and courage necessary to make the impossible routine. As she prepared for sleep on her final night at Moody Air Force Base, Ghost thought about the families of the 8 men she had rescued, people she would never meet who were living their lives because one pilot had refused to accept that some things couldn't be done. Tomorrow, she would begin a career dedicated to ensuring that other families would have the same opportunity, that other impossible situations would find solutions in the hands of pilots trained to make the extraordinary seem routine. The transformation from cargo pilot to special operations aviator was complete, but Ghost understood that it was also just the beginning. Her real education would come from the missions that awaited her, from the challenges that would test not just her flying skills, but her ability to make decisions under pressure that could determine the success or failure of operations, whose importance extended far beyond the cockpit of any single aircraft. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep, knowing that her dreams would be filled with the sound of turbofan engines and the voices of people calling for help from places where help wasn't supposed to be able to reach them. In the morning, she would be one step closer to being the pilot who answered those calls, who brought hope to impossible places, who made the extraordinary routine through the simple expedient of refusing to accept that anything was truly beyond the reach of someone with the right aircraft, the right training, and the right attitude about the difference between difficult and impossible.